It is so good to see so many faces that haven't been seen for a while. It's nice to see some faces back. It's nice to see visitors. Really appreciate all of you being here. This morning's lesson is going to start kind of peculiarly. Just bear with me if you would. It's been stated that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And my mom was watching a comedian. Many of you that are older will remember Steve Allen. He had a talk show, and he had a psychologist come on there one time and said the two instinctive fears in humanity are fear of loud noises and fear of falling. And without missing a beat, Mr. Allen said, "I have a great fear of making a loud noise while falling." And I kind of wonder, when did falling become a funny thing? You know, I can remember the last words of my grandpa: "Quit shaking the ladder, I'm going to fall off." That's not true. But you know, falling has been a source of humor for years. I don't know how long. I can remember back where Charlie Chaplin, did a lot of pratfalls and things like that. Dick Van Dyke, if you ever watched him, the very opening of that sitcom on TV, he falls over an ottoman. And Jim Carrey took it off the deep edge. I mean, Jim Carrey did so many physical things that were funny and pratfalls. Even broke 3 of his ribs one time falling. It's amazing how that seems to be funny unless you are involved or about to be involved in the fall. And having that be a present threat is kind of scary. I went hunting in Colorado one time on my motorcycle. Yeah, I know most of you are saying you deserve whatever you got. But anyway, I went up there on a motorcycle, and I'm going over Rabbit Ears Pass. It's snowing, and there's ice, but you can't see it. That's when I first discovered that black ice matters. But anyway, I'm looking out here at all this ice all over the road, and I'm scared to death because I can't see where the next patch of ice is. Now, it was really scary going up Rabbit Ears Pass. But you know what really was scary? Coming down. Because as I began to gather speed, I would put on my brakes, and there was no traction. And I was looking at a curve down there, and I'm going, I can't slow down. Now, fortunately, I made it over Rabbit Ears Pass, but I never took a bike to Colorado again. If that tells you I can be taught. But nevertheless, falling is not nearly so funny as a lot of people would like it to be. I mean, we laugh at it. I don't know why. But it just tickles our funny bone sometimes. Maybe it's that old formula they talk about when you talk about humor. That's tragedy plus time. And that is what humor is. Because during the course of the fall, it's not funny at all. As a matter of fact, I want you to turn in your Bibles. Keep your thumb on Galatians 5, but I want you to turn in your Bibles back to Ecclesiastes. This is a book written by an old guy. Okay? He's an old fellow that he's looking at his life in retrospect and seeing where he's been. But he's also very realistic. In the close of the book, in chapter 12, he begins, in fact, he warns kids, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, because you're gonna get to days like he was in where it's not fun anymore. And so y'all need to remember the days, God in the days of your youth, because it's going to get rough. And so therefore, he starts from verse 2 all the way through verse 5. He talks about the things that can go wrong with your body, and I'm not going to go into all those. And of course, in verse 6, he talks about how we die. And then in verse 7, where we go after we die. And then in verse 8, he sums it up with that all life is vanity. And his conclusion at the end of it is you need to fear God and keep his commandments. But inset in that aging process, which is so poetically descriptive, he says in verse 5, check that out. Also, they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way. My fear of heights has, and I'm still young pretty much, but my fear of heights has heightened. Because falling down, I don't bounce nearly as well as I used to. Can any of y'all relate to that? I used to hit the ground and hop right back up. I can remember our son, youngest son, flying through the room and missing the hallway just this much. And when he hit the wall, he went down, and we thought, he's done. Then just clocked him right there. He hopped up and said, "Oh, I ain't hurt," and ran on down the hall. And we thought, that boy's special. But falling is not funny. It gets to, it's a pain. It hurts. In fact, it is amazing to me how we respond to it. Because the more we know about being able to fall, the more panicky we tend to get about it. And sometimes, especially in the young, the hubris of youth, they don't really understand as well that they can fall. And that's where a good parent is right there beside them. You've seen the picture the first time you get to ride on a two-wheel bicycle, and the parent is standing right there doing the crawfish shuffle as the bike goes down, hands, palms in the air, trying to be there just in case they fall. And I've never seen a kid yet that's worried about mom or dad standing on the side. They're looking at the bike and having a blast trying to drive a two-wheel bike. But as we get older, we begin to concern ourselves with the concept of falling, and it's a lot more serious. And so therefore we take it much more serious. Although I have discovered, and this is just from visiting folks on occasion, and I'll pick on Marion since she's not here. I got permission. But Marion's 94, and to fall and the consequences of falling, to break a hip at age 92 when she broke her hip, that's almost like a death warrant. I mean, you're just almost done. Now, not Marion, of course. Marion's tougher than a box of nails. But she's back up, still going. Here she is, 94. But, when she gets up and she follows me to the door as I'm leaving the house, she won't use her walker. Okay, that's just got to go and throw it out there. She won't use her sympathy stick. She just gets up and starts walking. And Luda, the lady that helps her there, is coming behind her, either dragging the walker or the stick or both of them as she goes to the door. And I've gotten to the point where I go real slow so that she comes right up. And she finally caught on the other day and said, "Would you get out of my way?" And I said, "Marion, if you fall, I want to catch you. And I'm getting slow. I can't get to you if you fall." You see the concern we have for falling when we know it is possible to fall. In fact, the threat is real. In fact, it's kind of odd to me that we would not heed the warning. We would not go out of our way to warn someone or try to help someone when we know that potential of falling is there. Now, I have to concede, like that bike illustration a while ago I gave, the young person on the bike's not really worried about falling. They're riding a bike and having fun. I have noticed that they don't mind mama standing there, or dad not standing, but crawfishing along with them, because that's a security blanket they have, and it'll keep them safe. But I have discovered as people get older, I gotta be careful here because there is a contingency in this audience that's a little older. Like Marion, when you get up and you try to help them, they don't appreciate it. In fact, I have been told point blank, "I can manage, I'll do just fine." Or Marion, "Get out of my way." It's kind of that way when you talk about falling spiritually. In fact, I don't know why the connection's never made. It's almost counterintuitive to believe that you can't fall from grace when everything about our existence physically says, yes, there is a potential of falling. Even if you're young, if you're not careful, you will fall. When you get older, it heightens the sense of that fear that we have of falling. And so in Ecclesiastes, we read there in verse 5, "And they are afraid of height, and the terror's in the way." It's just a poetic way of saying we get to a point in our lives physically where the potential to fall and all of the consequences that come from it. And it's, physical problems, yes, that's one, but there's also embarrassment, some of the consequences. I've noticed sometimes, I like watching people, and you watch people, and particularly in a mall, you're sitting in a mall or a big shopping center, and you watch people, and somebody falls. It's amazing to me how the first thing that happens is they jump up and look around to see if anybody saw them. And then they start walking away with the grimace on their face because they realize that hurt. But the first thing they look at is, "Oh, I'm embarrassed, I fell." There's all kinds of consequences to falling. And we have such great concern about someone who has the potential to fall. It's just counterintuitive to me to decide in religion, well, once I become a Christian, I've got it made, I'll never fall, there's never a potential for it, I'm good to go, God's got me. It's not a problem. Because it makes nonsense of a great deal of what Paul, Jesus, Peter, many of the other inspired writers, but the Son of God particularly, warned against concerning falling from grace. And what I'm going to get to in the punchline, and I'll tell you ahead of time, so when we get there you'll understand what I'm talking about. Where's the concern? Like the parent who runs beside the bicycle because there might be a fall. like the elderly person who might fall, and we stand ready to assist them so that they don't fall. We know what the damage is. We know the seriousness of the moment, and yet, where's our concern when it comes to spiritually falling? You know, the entire letter of Galatians was written to a group of churches that had had doctrine seep in that would jeopardize their souls. Now, first, let's understand that the potential for falling is there. We can fall from grace. We can get a sour doctrine, and we've been commanded over and over to be diligent about, studying to show ourselves approved unto God. Because we got to handle right the Scriptures if we're going to know what God says to us, so that we don't get befuddled and led astray by some neat new doctrine that comes in. And I know a lot of that comes from panic. Panic sometimes comes before a fall, physically. It does that spiritually too. You look around and there's not as many folk here as there used to be. Something has changed in the tenor or the attitude of people. And you can even apply this, personally. Individuals, you kind of concern yourself with them because they're not who they used to be. There seems to be more danger in the fall and the consequences of the fall. But my question would be, where's the concern? Because there are warnings all throughout the Bible. 1 Corinthians 10 and 12 being one of them. To him who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Well, in the first place, that implies you can fall. It would be crazy for someone to warn you, don't jump off the roof and then float off the earth instead of hit the earth. Not likely that to happen, right? And of course, again, I don't see anything. I've just heard the illustrations used. I've used some myself about how absurd it would be to say, I'm going to identify as a bird, get up on the roof, and jump off. How's that working out for you? Some TV personalities might ask. Because when you hit the ground, it's going to hurt. We're afraid of falling. We realize that falling is a potential. And yet, spiritually speaking, the same thing exists. And I have noticed, spiritually speaking, we always talk about these young people and how they just don't listen, particularly teenagers, which they do go deaf for a few years. But, they don't listen, they don't hear. But you know what I've discovered in many years of preaching and teaching and talking to people and trying to encourage them to get right with God, where they are in a fallen circumstance? As people get older and more entrenched in what they know and what they're comfortable with, they don't appreciate you telling them you may be falling. And they don't appreciate the help sometimes to change the way they are or what they're doing or how they think about things. It's just not real pleasant sometimes, which, by the way, that's a preacher's job. I'm here to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So therefore, when I preach and teach, I'm going to preach God's truth, and what it's going to be full of is the same thing that Paul filled his lessons with. Be afraid, be very afraid. Understand you can fall, and understanding that, take appropriate action to keep that from happening. In Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, beginning in the 12th, let me look again at my notes, the 3rd chapter, the 12th and the 13th verse. Beware, brethren, the Hebrew writer says, lest there be any of you with an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Now, the interesting thing about this text is you can't depart something into which you were not in at one point in time. So therefore, that they're talking about somebody that's in a good position and they're departing from it. Don't do that, but exhort one another daily. You are to be commended for being here this morning. You realize Hebrews 10, later on in this book, 10, 24, and 25, says we're supposed to gather on the first day of the week. You know why? Provoke one another to good works. Encourage each other, lift each other up. In fact, we're told, don't forsake that assembling of yourselves together. And here's part of the reason why. We exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And that can only happen if we don't have each other near each other to encourage each other and cause us to be stronger than who we were. Of course, that goes without saying that you have to be receptive to the truth of God when you look at your life in honesty and decide, yeah, I need to change. I need help here because there is a danger in my falling. Nobody likes to hear, hey, you're on the ragged edge, you should watch that. But in 1 Timothy, we're told that there are people who have that issue. In 1 Timothy, it was predicted, chapter 4, verse 1, that there were going to be people who depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Timothy was told, you need to expect that some people will depart from the faith. I always like this verse because you can't get any more direct in understanding that there is always a danger for us of departing the faith. We need to look at ourselves and examine ourselves and know we're in the faith. We need to continually be aware that we can fall. You don't need to panic and you don't need to fret. You don't need to obsess about it. I understand that. But you have to be aware of the fact that that is potential. And that being the case, it'll make us all the more disciplined, all the more discerning. We will try harder in diligence to maintain our faithfulness because there is that potential of falling. As we get older, maybe it doesn't look greatest, but you know what? It's safer if I carry this stick and steady myself. David just come up here. I pick on David all the time. David just came up here with a stick. You can talk to him about why he's like that. Had polio way back in the day, right? He overcame it, but he still uses a stick because David's a great guy, but he's not that steady without a stick. I'm just saying, right? I don't know where the pride is in that. I don't know where the embarrassment would be in that if you understand what your limitation is and you embrace it and you take precautions so you don't fall, because you know the consequences of what happens when you fall. I've never understood why people will not, just decide not to attend the Lord's assemblies. I don't understand that. I mean, I understand that we're not nearly as exciting as Jimmy was talking about in class this morning. In some churches, we don't have a dog and pony show. But I can guarantee you this, what we do have is the truth of the gospel taught and the encouragement of each other so that we can be better than what we were. And I also understand as we get older, we don't want to hear so much of that, but you know what? It's good for us to understand that there is a potential to fall. And this is the one way that we can get together and encourage each other to do better than what we've been doing, to be better than who we once were. So what happens when somebody falls? How does that work? Because we do fall. The Galatians had fallen here. In fact, he warns them flat out. Some of you have fallen. In verse 4, you have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace. There were some Galatians here that were no longer saved. They were in an unsaved state because of the doctrine that they had embraced and accepted. And he said, you need to quit that. The whole book of Galatians is about avoiding that, and different ways that we can avoid that. Don't have time to get into those, but certainly it is the case. We can avoid it. But what happens when you fall? One of the greatest examples I know is Peter. I don't think Peter was better or worse than any other of the apostles. Okay? I think it's quite gracious of Peter to accept the fact that a great many things he did are recorded for us. Of course, that's what happens when you're a leader, and Peter was a leader. I mean, when he and John ran to the empty tomb, John's younger guy, he outran him. You know, no problem. But when they got the tomb, Peter went in first. Peter would be the first one to stay. You know, when Jesus said, y'all are all going to forsake me. Oh, Peter, no, not going to happen. No, Lord, I'm going to hang with you. And, of course, that's when Jesus told him, you know, before the cock crows 3 times, when the old rooster gets after it, you're going to have denied me already 3 times. I can't imagine the look on his face, the feeling in his heart as he raised himself from that fire where the girl was telling him, yeah, you've got to be one of them. And he's going, I don't know the man, with oaths and cursing, to look across the veranda there, or whatever you'd call it, where Jesus is over there in a mock trial that was illegal, Jewishly speaking, being beaten, spat upon, slapped, to have Jesus turn and look at him. See, I'm married. I know what it's like when my wife looks at me sometimes. No words are necessary. And there Peter stood, having denied Christ. What do you do? Let me tell you, it's not the end of the game, but you've got to have an attitude that is repentant, or all you could do in the world is not going to make up for it. Peter, it says, went out and wept bitterly. There was a sincere sorrow for having done what he did. I've always thought it was such a great blessing to be the chief spokesman when the church first began. And who is the chief spokesman? Peter, the same guy that denied Christ. Folks, it's not hopeless when you fall. You are not in any place now that you can't get out of should you so decide to say, I know I can fall, I may be fallen, but I can fix that. As a matter of fact, Jesus is our no-fall insurance. If you belong to Christ, it's not as though you cannot fall, but you can keep yourself from falling if you will be diligent to take heed to yourself and to the doctrine, 1 Timothy 4:16 says. If you'll understand that you've got to resist the devil, James 4:7. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. You've got to be proactive in this deal here. You've got to decide, I'm going to follow Jesus. We sing a song, I decided to follow Jesus. Really? I wonder sometimes how many people sing that song when in their life, that's not what you see. I have decided to follow Jesus. We say it redundantly 3 or 4 times during the course of the verses in that song. I've decided to follow Jesus. Really? Look at how you're living. Does that manifest to someone who has decided to follow Jesus? You got to realize you can fall. There's only one exception to that, and that's the sad one back in Hebrews again, if you would. In Hebrews, the 10th chapter, where he tells us about our assembly to encourage each other towards good works, to do the right thing. In Hebrews, the 10th chapter and the 26th verse, and this is one of the most frightening. Remember, I started with the idea that fear is one of those things inherently in us. Falling and fear. I'm going to read Hebrews 10:26 and following. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. But here's what's left. But a certain fearful expectation of judgment, fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. He goes on to explain the Old Testament law, how by mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, you could be condemned. But he says, of how much worse punishment do you suppose? And here's the list of things that you and I would do if we fell from grace. If we left God, if we quit doing what we know we should be doing. Here's where we fit. How much worse punishment do you suppose will be, he thought, worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot? I know we don't think of our just deciding not to go to church. That's the old phrase that's used, not to attend a worship assembly. Or just to say a word now and then that's not right, or not do something good to someone when we see the opportunity. I know we don't think of it that way, but the Bible says what you're doing is you're trampling the Son of God underfoot. Counting the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing. You've lost your spirituality when you get to that point and insulted the Spirit of grace. There's no doubt about this. The Hebrew writer is saying you're not in a good stead if you're fallen. And if you intend to stay that way, it is even worse. As a matter of fact, what scares me and ought to scare any intelligent person, in verse 31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. That is the only fall I am deathly afraid of. To fall into the hands of a living God not prepared. My friends, there is nothing on this planet worth going to hell for. Nothing. Change your life. If you need to do something this morning, we always invite with an invitation song. It's geared to help you consider where you are and what you need to do to get right. If you've done something publicly, you need to repent publicly. That's great. We're ready to assist you and lift you back up. Galatians 6:1. We, lift those up who are fallen or overcoming a fall. If it's private and personal, you know if you need to respond and get your life right. I'd invite you to get your life right before we leave this building. Won't you stand as we sing?